part 3 of comms now. We're going to continue looking at the construction team, but particularly at this management team. Excuse me. At the end of this part of the session, I want you all to be able to list and describe the roles of the people who've been involved in designing large projects, and also give a rough description of the role of the clerk of works, quantity surveyor, and estimator. So as well as the people who work on site and the inspectors, which we've looked at already, there's a lot of people who work off site, either as part of the design process or as generally as in logistics, making sure that things run smoothly. Generally speaking, the people I'm going to talk about will be people who work for larger organisations that would work on the biggest building projects. But no matter the size of the project, there will always be a client. The client is the person who pays for the project, so therefore the client has got overall responsibility for the project. And under the CDM regs, it's actually the client's responsibility to make sure that they actually bring in an appropriate main contractor. I'm going to briefly talk about tendering for a job, and this again normally only happens on the largest of jobs, really. If there was a really big job, the client would put the job out to tender, and basically the different companies would look at the specifications and requirements for the job, and then the estimator for that company would work out roughly how much it would cost to do. They'd add in a little bit on top for profit for themselves, and then develop some paperwork explaining sort of how they'd carry out the job essentially and how much it would cost. And then they would submit that to the client, and this client would then pick essentially what they believe the right person for the job would be. The person that they picked to take overall responsibility for the job would be described as the main contractor, and that main contractor might hire in other companies to do certain parts of the job, and they'd be described as subcontractors. So you've got the client who's leading up the process, who then sort of bring in their main contractor, who might bring in further subcontractors. The main contractor would have responsibility for making sure the job is delivered on time and on budget. When it comes to designing the project, that would be done by the architect. The architect does all the drawings and designs the building to meet the requirements set in the building regulations. They would also work alongside and with specialist design engineers, because the architect, even though they spend 7 years studying, they're not going to know absolutely everything that there is to know. So they work with specialist design engineers. For example, they might work with a mechanical engineer who might design the lifts on a large contract, a structural engineer who might design the load-bearing beams. Structural engineers are anything to do with anything that might structurally impact the building. And on the plumbing side or electrical side, there might be a specific building services design engineer who would be involved in designing the plumbing side, for example, a large heating system. The next person in the chain of command would be the clerk of works. Some people call him the project manager. And depending on the size of the contract, the clerk of works might stay on site permanently, but more often than not, the clerk of works would be in charge of several projects, and they would sort of visit them periodically to check that the work that's being done is in line with the requirements set by the architect. So essentially, the clerk of works is the architect's representative on site, and he checks the work's been carried out the way that it's been set out in the architect's specifications. You can't always do things the way that they were planned. Sometimes in real life you come across sort of issues which don't sort of aren't so obvious on paper, and in those circumstances a variation order might be issued, and that would be issued by the Clerk of Works, and that's saying that we're going to do something different than the way it's set out in the architect's drawings. Normally the cost for that would be agreed between the Clerk of Works and the quantity surveyor of the other company, essentially, the subcontractor normally. Quick look at the role of the quantity surveyor. Okay, quantity surveyors involved in writing the contracts, checking that the building stays within budget, and agreeing staged payments. This is like they built right into the contract that, say for example, when the building work reaches a particular stage, then there'll be a payment made. So say for example, once all the foundations are in, there might be a payment made. When the external walls have been built, or the carcass has been built, there might be another stage payment. When all the pipe work's been installed, there might be another stage payment. When all of the first fix is complete, another stage payment, etc., etc. Okay, so the quantity surveyor would visit the construction site periodically and check the amount of materials that have been used, and have a look to see whether there are staged payments that are due. And then if there are, then he would create an invoice and sort of send it to the client, be it the main contractor if they're a subcontractor, or the actual client themselves if they are the main contractor. And and then they'd sort of get paid. Estimator's job is fairly similar to QS, but I mean they would kind of do the similar sort of stuff, but before the job starts. They'd sort of work out how much material it's likely to require to carry out the job. They'd also think about the amount of time and how much that's going to cost as well, obviously, because people need to be paid. And then he'd work out the approximate cost of how much the building would cost to build. And then he'd be involved in writing up the tender document, the sort of bid for the job. The buyer, also known as the procurement officer, is the person who would purchase the materials once the job started. Some companies have buyers who would sort of negotiate with suppliers to see if they could get better deals, basically. So ordering materials, this is a process for some larger building firms. You'd have to, in some cases, you'd have to fill out a requisition order, sometimes known as a purchase order, excuse me, which you'd send to your company, and then the buyer would order your materials on your behalf and get them delivered out to you. Okay, once the materials are delivered, they would come with a delivery advice note. Okay, a delivery advice note is basically a list of the goods that have been delivered, and you should sign it to sort of say that you've received it. Worth noting, okay, it's not going to come up in the test, but quite often when you're taking off all the materials from the van on site, you don't have time to check them all before the delivery driver goes. So if it was me, what I always used to do is I'd write unchecked on it before I signed it, and that way you can sort of, there's a bit of comeback if all of the stuff that they've said they've delivered hasn't been delivered, which does happen, you know. So paying for the materials, right? Once the materials have been ordered, once they've been delivered, the company would then be sent an invoice, and an invoice basically sort of is a bill. And once the bill's paid, the company would receive a remittance advice note, and that's basically like a receipt telling them that the bill's been paid. Now it is time for task number